Hester Vane sat alone in her car in the parking lot of the attorney's office for 11 minutes after her brothers left. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She just sat with the manila envelope in her lap, and the key inside it, and the sound of Clement's laugh still somewhere in the back of her head. $11. That was what her father had paid for the property at 14 Cutter's Gap Road. $11 at a tax auction 20 years ago. A condemned house in Krill County that the county had tried to demolish twice, and both times failed to get around to. No running water. No working electricity. A fire had taken part of the second floor. The roof had sections that had given up entirely. Her brothers had received the bank account, the truck, the investment certificates, the furniture, the land near Bowling Green. Between them, close to $120,000 and everything that could be carried or driven away. Hester had received a key to a building the county wanted to tear down. Clement laughed first. Forrest followed a second later, like he had been trying to hold it and couldn't. Her sister-in-law, who had no business being there at all, covered her mouth with 3 fingers. But it was the attorney, a man named Odell Fitch, who had said the one thing Hester could not stop turning over. Before he closed the folder, he had looked at her steadily and said, "He told me you would know what to do with it." Even if you didn't know that yet. She did not understand what that meant. In the back seat, Rue was asleep against the window. 7 years old, still in the corduroy jacket 2 sizes too large, her notebook opened in her lap at a half-finished drawing of something that might have been a horse. Hester looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she typed 14 Cutter's Gap Road into her phone and started the car. She did not know what her father had seen in that condemned building, but he had paid $11 for it and kept silent for 20 years and left it specifically to her. Not to the sons who drove newer cars and had not visited him in 18 months, but to the daughter who had driven 3 hours every other month to organize his medications and sit with him through the hospitalizations and answer the phone at 2 in the morning. She had done all of that because Rue deserved to know her grandfather, because someone had to, because that was what you did. But she had also done it carrying something her brothers did not know about, and her father had never fully apologized for. When Hester was 15, Birch Vane left. Not in the sudden way, not a single morning, but in a way that is harder to explain and harder to forgive. He suddenly stopped showing up. Phone calls that came less and less. Birthdays that passed without a word. A man who had decided, for reasons Hester never fully understood, that the distance was easier than the effort. She was angry for years. Then she got tired of being angry. Then she had Rue, and she had looked at her daughter and thought, I will not let her grow up without knowing what a grandfather is, even an imperfect one, even one who owes more than he can probably pay. So she drove, she organized, she answered the phone. And Birch Vane, in the last year of his life, had looked at her from a hospital bed and said, "You always look at things right." At the time, she had taken it as what it was. A dying man's small apology. A compliment offered too late to cover everything it needed to cover. Now, with the key in her hand and a sleeping daughter behind her and $308 in her account, she drove east toward Krill County, wondering if it had been something else entirely. Stay with me until the end. Because what Hester found inside that house did not just change her finances. It changed what she understood about her father, about herself, and about the difference between what a person deserves and what they are willing to go find. The drive to Krill County was 40 minutes east of Lexington, through bare winter fields and tree lines running along every ridge. Rue slept the whole way. Hester drove with the radio off. The GPS took her off the main road onto a county road, then onto a gravel lane between 2 fields, and there at the end of it, the house. She stopped the car. The photograph Fitch had given her had softened things. Up close, there was no softening. 2 stories of peeling white clapboard on a limestone foundation. The front porch had separated from the house on the left side, and hung at an angle that suggested the next hard winter would finish the job. Every ground floor window was boarded or broken. The fire damage on the upper right was worse than the photo showed. The exterior wall bowed outward, the collapsed roof section exposed dark rafters to the gray sky. A county notice on a wooden stake near the lane read demolition, order in letters that had faded but not disappeared. Weeds had pushed through the gravel all the way to the front steps. Rue woke as the car stopped. She leaned into the window and stared. Is that it? That's it, Hester said. Rue looked at it for a moment. It looks like it gave up. Hester looked at the stone foundation. At the front wall and the left side. Still square. At the proportions of the thing. The way it sat on the land like it intended to stay. Some things look that way, she said. Doesn't mean they have. She got out and walked the perimeter alone, while Rue sat on the porch steps with her notebook. The foundation was solid. The left side and front walls were holding. The porch looked bad, but wasn't structural. The fireside was real damage, but the bones underneath it were still there. She came back, got the key from the envelope, and went to the front door. The padlock was rusted nearly through. She pulled and it snapped. The key caught ground, then turned. The door swung open. Cold damp wood. Old ash. Something dry and faint underneath, like cedar or old paper. Hester stood in the doorway. She looked in. Then she stepped inside. The first week was about clearing and looking. She drove from the shelter each morning after dropping Rue at school, worked until dark, and drove back. She carried debris out by the bag. Plastered dust, broken glass, an old calendar on the kitchen wall from 1987, a wood chair with the back gone. She propped the porch with timber posts from the barn, patched 2 windows with plastic sheeting, swept the ground floor clean, enough to see what was under it. By the end of that week, she could see what the house was. High ceilings, a brick fireplace running floor to ceiling with a carved wood mantel, wide windows with deep sills, a stone hearth in the kitchen, a back staircase with thick timber treads that barely flexed even now. The house had a quality she had not been able to feel through all the wreckage. Someone had thought about every decision in this structure, had built it to last and meant it. But on the 3rd day of clearing, she found something else. On the floor of the kitchen near the back wall was a set of boot prints. Recent ones. The dust in the rest of the house had settled into a uniform gray undisturbed for decades, but these prints were sharp-edged and clean. Whoever had made them had been here within the last few months. Not a county inspector. The condemnation notice on the stake outside had a date from 3 years ago. Not a trespasser either. The padlock had been on the door when she arrived. She had broken it herself. Someone had been here before she had the key. Someone who had walked the kitchen, stood at the back door, looked out toward the barn, then left without forcing any entry and without saying a word to anyone about what they had seen. Hester stood in the kitchen and looked at those prints for a long time. She did not have an answer. She filed it away and kept working. She was checking the walls beside the fireplace for water damage, palms flat against the plaster. Then her right hand found something. Not soft. Something harder than the surrounding plaster. A shape beneath it with square edges. She stepped back and ran her phone light slowly along the wall. She could see it now. A rectangle, roughly 2 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall. Plastered over and painted to match everything around it, so carefully that you would never see it unless you press your hand in exactly the right place. Someone had hidden something behind that wall. Hester did not move for a long moment. Then she went to get the hammer. The first strike sent a burst of white dust into the cold air. She swung again and pulled back. When she shone her light into the gap, she stopped breathing for a second. Metal. It was not framing. It was not a pipe. It was something that had been placed there deliberately a long time ago. She put the hammer down and used her hands, pulling the plaster away section by section until the shape beneath it finally came clear. It was a safe. Wall-mounted, built directly into the framing cavity, and plastered over so flush that without knowing where to press, you would search this room 1,000 times and never find it. Steel body, combination dial with an Art Deco border pressed into the face, handlebar below. Hester crouched in front of it and put her hand on the dial. She pressed the handle. Nothing happened. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had found. A hidden safe inside the wall of a condemned house on 4 acres of Krill County, Kentucky. Her father had paid $11 for this. Her brothers had laughed at her across a mahogany table. She took a photograph. Then she went to pick up Rue from school. That evening, sitting at the shelter's common table while Rue drew beside her, Hester searched her phone for locksmiths in Krill County. She found one name, Aubrey Solt. 38 years in the trade. Operated out of a converted garage on the edge of Krill Junction. She called him in the morning. Aubrey drove out the next day in a pickup with a rusted toolbox in the bed. Lean man, early 70s, hands that moved over the safe like they already understood it. He put his ear to the door and turned the dial 3 times. Not trying to open it, just listening to what it had to say. Pre-war, he said. Probably the 1930s. Good machine. He straightened. Mechanism seized. Combinations gone. I can drill it or coax it. Drilling damages the door. Coaxing takes longer. Coax it, Hester said. He came back 3 days later. He worked for 4 hours without hurrying. Then, at 2:40 in the afternoon, with Rue doing homework on the living room floor, there was a sound from inside the wall. A deep mechanical release. A click that had been waiting longer than Hester had been alive. Aubrey turned the handle. The safe door swung open. Before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, drop your location in the comments. Your city, your state, your country, wherever you are in this world, we want to know you are there. We read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. You do not want to miss what comes next. For a second, Hester did not move. She just stared into the opening. Aubrey leaned forward slightly. What is it? Hester did not answer. Then she reached in. The inside was dry. The old steel had kept out everything the years had done to the rest of the house. Bundles, wrapped in cloth gone brown and stiff with age, tied with cord that crumbled when touched. She lifted the nearest one and unwrapped it slowly. A pocket watch, gold case, engraved on the back. 1911. She set it down and reached for another. A brooch, yellow gold, small stones that caught the light even in the dimness. A man's ring with a dark red stone. A folded document in careful old handwriting. Then 2 heavier bundles, and when she opened them, stacks of old currency. Bills flat and dry, held in brittle rubber bands that snapped when she touched them. She held one note under her phone light. Large format, detailed engraving. Serial numbers were clear. The condition was not something she had words for. Rue appeared at her shoulder and looked into the safe. She took a long, slow breath. Mom, she said, what is all that? Hester kept her voice even. I don't know yet. At the very back of the safe, upright against the rear wall, was a tin box. Inside the tin, wrapped in a second layer of cloth, was a letter. 3 pages. Black ink faded to brown but completely legible. The letter was dated October 14th, 1943. The man's name was Corvin Shade. He had been born in this house in 1881. He had built most of it himself, lived his whole life inside it, worked the land, married, and lost his wife to pneumonia in 1939. In October of 1943, with his health failing and his only son somewhere in Europe, he had made a decision about everything he had spent a lifetime gathering. He wrote clearly. He was not a man who wasted words. He described each item in the safe. The watch had been his father's. The jewelry had been his wife's. The currency he had drawn from his bank accounts beginning in 1932, after watching a neighbor lose everything when his bank failed. He had never trusted paper institutions again after that. He listed the denominations. He listed the gold coins beneath the currency bundles, which Hester had not yet reached. He wrote that he had hidden these things because he did not trust what the world was becoming. He had seen one war. He had survived the Depression. He had watched people who did everything right lose everything anyway. He wrote, "If my son comes home, he will find this. I have left him a letter telling him where to look. If my son does not come home," he wrote, "I trust this house to hold it. The right person will come eventually. I have faith in that." He signed it, Corvin Shade. October 1943. Hester sat on the floor where Corvin Shade had been born and read the letter twice in the cold January light. She thought about a man writing those words alone in this house in 1943, sealing up everything he had made and trusted and loved behind a wall of plaster, and believing, with no evidence, no guarantee, that the right person would eventually arrive. She thought about her father, paying $11 for this building 20 years ago, never fixing it, never selling it, never saying a word about it to anyone except his attorney, leaving it specifically to the daughter he had once abandoned and never fully repaired, with one strange line from a lawyer. She would know what to do with it, even if she didn't know that yet. She thought about the February hospitalization. 2 in the morning, the plastic chair, his eyes opening and finding hers in the dark room. You always look at things right. She had thought it was the morphine talking, or guilt, or both. She reached back into the safe and lifted the currency bundles out. Beneath them, as the letter described, was a cloth pouch. She untied it. 26 gold coins, double eagle denomination, American issue. Their surfaces still warm-looking, still bright, 80 years in the dark. She held one in her palm. Then she looked up at Rue, who had not moved, who was watching her with wide and very serious eyes. Are we going to be okay now? Rue asked. Hester closed her fingers around the coin. Yes, she said. We are. That night, after Rue fell asleep on the couch under the quilt Carla Overbeck had brought over the week before, the house was quiet except for the slow ticking of the pocket watch that Aubrey had managed to wind earlier that afternoon. Hester sat alone at the kitchen table. The lantern light was low. The fields outside were black. The gold coin lay in the center of the table. For a long time she did not touch it. She just looked at it. 8 weeks ago she had been counting her last $40 in a grocery store parking lot, deciding between gas and food. 6 weeks ago she had been telling a woman at the shelter intake desk that yes, they would only stay a little while. 3 weeks ago, in the back seat of the car on the way to school, Rue had asked her quietly whether sleeping in the car was normal. Hester had told her it was temporary. She said it with the same voice she had used this afternoon. She picked up the coin, heavier than it looked, warm from the lantern light. Her fingers closed around it slowly, and then, quietly, with no one watching, the part of her that had been holding everything together for the past 8 months finally slipped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a breath that broke in the middle. She leaned forward and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. The whole room went quiet. She thought about her father, about the hospital room in February, the plastic chair, his hand pale against the sheet. About the years before that, the ones when he had not shown up. The birthdays that passed. The silence that went on so long it stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like weather, just a condition of the life she was living. She had forgiven him, or something close to it, because Rue needed a grandfather and Hester needed to stop carrying the weight of it. But she had never stopped wondering what it would have cost him, even once, to choose differently. Slowly, her breathing came back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She thought about the last thing he had ever said to her in that hospital room. You always look at things right. Maybe he had known about the safe. Maybe he had not. Maybe he had bought an $11 house on pure instinct and left it to the one child he had wronged the most and trusted her to find whatever there was to find. Maybe that was the only apology he knew how to make. She set the coin back on the table. Across the room, Rue shifted under the quilt and murmured something soft and unintelligible. Hester looked over at her daughter, at the small, serious face gone slack in sleep. She smiled, tired, quiet, but real. Yeah, she whispered into the dark house. We're going to be okay. If this story is touching you right now, please take a moment and drop your location in the comments. Your city, your country, wherever you are in this world. We read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. We have more stories coming and we do not want you to miss them. Let us keep going. She did not call her brothers that day or the day after. She drove into Krill Junction and found a small antique shop on the town square called Prater's Old and Found. The owner was a woman named Joss Prater, mid-60s, precise, with reading glasses on a chain and the focused attention of someone who had spent decades learning how to see accurately. Joss looked at the pocket watch under a magnifier, turned the brooch in her hands, examined 2 of the currency notes under a loupe. She put everything down. Where did these come from? Hester told her. Joss was quiet for a moment. The currency needs a specialist before you do anything else. Large format notes in this condition are not common. The gold is significant. Double eagles haven't circulated since 1933. She folded her hands. I know a man in Lexington. Perry Alcott. He's the person you call before you talk to anyone else. Hester drove back to the house. That evening, she called Perry Alcott. Perry Alcott came out 6 days later with a light box, a loop, and a leather case of reference materials. He worked beside the fireplace for 3 hours, steady, unhurried, photographing each note, each coin, cross-referencing against his records. When he finished, he sat across from Hester at the kitchen table. "Miss Vane," he said, "I want to give you a working number, not a final appraisal. That will take several weeks, and I'll bring in a paper currency specialist from Louisville. But you need to understand what you are sitting with." He opened his notebook and turned it toward her. The low end of his estimate was $290,000. The high end was $420,000. Hester read it once, then again. She thanked him, shook his hand at the door, and watched his car disappear down the gravel lane. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the wall where an old safe had been waiting in the dark for 80 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Clement, just checking in. "Let us know if you need anything." She set the phone face down and did not pick it up again that night. She called Fitch the following morning. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The legal position is straightforward. Contents discovered within an inherited property after title transfers belong to the title holder. Your brothers have no claim." "They'll try anyway," Hester said. "Probably," Fitch said. "Winning isn't the point. Creating legal pressure costs you money and time, and they know it." A pause. "There is something else I want to show you. Come by the office." She drove to Lexington the next day. On Fitch's desk was a notarized affidavit signed by Birch Vane 14 months before his death. It stated that the property at 14 Cutters Gap Road was being left to his daughter Hester in its entirety, all structures, all land, all contents, whether known or unknown to any party. That this reflected his considered judgment. That the bequest was not to be contested. Hester read it. "He knew," she said. "He told me he had reason to believe the house held more than it appeared to hold," Fitch said carefully. "He would not say more than that. But he was very specific about making sure you were protected." Hester looked at the document for a long moment, at her father's signature. Deliberate, unhurried. The signature of a man who had made up his mind. "He always said I looked at things right," she said. Fitch nodded. It seems he counted on that. She drove back to Krill County. That evening she got a call from Fitch again. His voice was careful. "There is something you need to know before this goes further," he said. "During my review of the property documentation, I came across county access records. Someone filed a request to inspect the property at 14 Cutters Gap Road approximately 3 weeks before your father passed." Hester said nothing. The name on the request, Fitch said, was Forrest Vane. The line was quiet. Hester thought about the boot prints in the kitchen, the clean sharp edges in the settled dust, the way they stopped in the center of the room, exactly where she had later stood when she pressed her hand against the wall and felt the edge of the safe. He had been inches away from it. Now she had her answer. Forrest had been there. He had filed a formal inspection request, driven out to Krill County, walked the property, and then said nothing. Not to Hester. Not to Clement. Not to anyone. He had stood in the attorney's office and laughed with his brother and made the offer to buy her out for $10,000. And he had already been there. "Did he go inside?" Hester asked. "The inspection record shows the exterior only," Fitch said. The padlock was still in place. "But he was on that property, Hester. And he made a decision not to mention it. Would that affect the legal case?" "It complicates his standing to claim injury from surprise," Fitch said. "We will use it if we need to." For a long time after she hung up, she could not do anything but sit with what she now knew about her brother. She thought about the way Forrest had looked at her across the attorney's table. The offer delivered in a voice arranged to sound generous. $10,000. Enough to cover whatever you've spent. He had been there. He had seen the padlock. He walked away and said nothing and came to that office and laughed. That was not wounded. That was something different. She did not call him. She went back to work on the house. Clement called 4 days after Perry's visit. Small towns talk, and someone at the hardware store had mentioned something to someone, and the story had moved through Creel Junction the way stories do in small places, quickly and completely. Clement said he thought there might be undisclosed estate assets. He said a conversation about equitable distribution seemed appropriate, given what everyone had been through. Hester let him finish. Dad left very clear instructions, she said. I'm going to honor them. You know this isn't right, Hester. I know what I was left, she said. And I know which one of us drove to Krill County in January to look at a condemned house instead of laughing at it. She hung up. Forrest called 2 days after that. Softer. He talked about family, about not letting money pull them apart, about what their father would have wanted. He used the word reasonable 4 times. He did not mention the inspection visit. You had 14 months to talk Dad out of this if you thought it was wrong, Hester said. He had 14 months to change his mind. Neither of you did. You're not being fair, Forrest said. I'm being clear, she said. That's different. The formal letter arrived 9 days later. A Lexington law firm, representing Clement and Forrest jointly. Undisclosed estate assets. Cessation of sale pending resolution. Hester photographed it and sent it to Fitch. His reply came within the hour expected. We're prepared. Don't engage. She set the letter on the kitchen table and went back to work on the house. There was still a great deal of work left, and none of the money had arrived yet. She was still at the shelter with Rue, still working the motel job 3 days a week. The artifacts were in the appraisal process and would be for months. The house was still condemned on paper, but something had shifted in her. She had been poor long enough to know that broken and worthless were not the same thing. She had seen it in the house and she felt it in herself. She worked every day the light allowed. A semi-retired carpenter named Orville Dietz drove past one afternoon and saw her on a ladder nailing roofing felt over a damaged section above the kitchen. He pulled in and stood at the base of the ladder. You know what you're doing up there, he said. Learning, she said without stopping. He went to his truck, came back with a tool belt, climbed the ladder. Move over, he said. I'll show you the right way. He came back the next 3 Saturdays, always with something. A coil of drip edge, a box of ring shank nails, once a full sheet of OSB. He never asked for payment. He had a granddaughter about Rue's age and mentioned it once and did not mention it again. A retired teacher named Carla Overbeck stopped one evening with vegetable soup and crackers and stayed 2 hours on the porch, talking to Rue, listening to what Hester was trying to do. She came back twice more with food, and the third time brought a bag of Rue-size winter clothing from the church exchange, folded and clean. Rue, for her part, had begun to love the house with the intensity of a child who had been without walls for too long. She drew it constantly in her notebook. The house as it was, the house as it might be, the house with smoke coming from the chimney and flowers along the front that were not there yet, but would be. She had named the pocket watch Gerald. She talked to it sometimes when Hester was in another room. One afternoon she came to find Hester pulling old plaster in the upstairs hallway and said, Mom, do you think the man who hid everything knew he was going to die? Hester kept working. Probably. Was he scared? I think he was careful, Hester said. Scared and careful are different. Rue considered this. What's the difference? Hester stopped. She looked at her daughter. Scared people hide, she said. Careful people make sure the right things survive. Rue thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Perry Alcott returned 6 weeks later with Delia Marsh, a paper currency specialist from Louisville with 30 years in the field. They worked at the kitchen table for 3 hours while Rue did homework in the living room using a battery lantern. When they finished, Delia opened her folder and set it on the table. She did not build it. She just said the number. The full collection appraised at $387,000. After fees and costs, Hester would receive $341,000. Hester read the number. She looked up at Perry. He nodded once. She sat with it, a woman who had been counting $40 in a parking lot 8 weeks ago, who had said it's temporary in the back seat of a car while her daughter looked out the window at the shelter sign. She did not cry. She sat quietly and let it become real at the pace it needed to become real. Rue appeared in the doorway. She looked at her mother's face and read it the way children read faces before they learn to look away. Good news, she asked. Hester looked at her daughter. Come here, she said. Rue crossed the room, and Hester put both arms around her. Does this mean we're rich? Rue asked into her shoulder. Hester held her tighter. No, she said. It means we can breathe. The hearing at Krill County Courthouse was a Thursday in late March. Limestone building on the town square, floor polish and old wood, and the particular quiet of a place where serious decisions are made routinely. Clement and Forrest arrived with two attorneys from a Lexington firm. Clement looked straight ahead. Forrest looked at Hester once in the hallway. Something in his face had contracted since the phone calls. He knew she knew. The judge was Honorable Winslow Carr, 65, known for running a tight courtroom and tolerating very little he considered a waste of his time. Fitch presented first. He submitted the affidavit, the title history, the appraisal documentation, and every meeting record from the drafting of the will. He was not dramatic. He presented it the way a man presents facts when the facts are sufficient. The opposing attorneys argued vague language, undisclosed assets, undue influence. The suggestion that Hester's caregiving had been strategic, that the bequest needed scrutiny. Hester sat beside Fitch and kept her face level. It still cut, not because it shook what she knew about why she had shown up for her father, but because it took something real and turned it into a legal maneuver. That reduction was its own kind of damage. Fitch responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Birch Vane's physician, his neighbor of 15 years, and the nurses at his rehabilitation facility. Each described a man in full possession of himself. He submitted the county access records showing Forrest's inspection visit to the property 3 weeks before Birch died. The opposing attorneys had not known he was going to do that. Forrest heard it and said nothing, but his face said everything. Fitch did not editorialize. He let the documents speak. Judge Carr reviewed everything. The courtroom was very quiet. Then he spoke. The claim of undisclosed estate assets was not supported by the will, the affidavit, or Kentucky property law. The claim of undue influence was directly contradicted by the documentation presented. He noted, without elaboration, that the access records raised questions about the credibility of the surprise being claimed. The motion was denied in full. He moved to the next matter without ceremony. Outside, the air was cold and bright. The maples on the courthouse square were starting to bud. Clement walked past Hester without speaking. His attorneys were already on their phones. Forrest stopped. His voice was very quiet. "I should have told you," he said. "When I went out there, I should have told you I'd been." Hester looked at him. He was not calculating anything. He was just a man standing in the cold with the thing he had done visible on his face. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He shook his head. He did not have an answer that covered it. "That matters," she said. "What you just said. But it doesn't change anything." She walked with Fitch to his car. He drove her back to Cutter's Gap Road. They sat in the gravel lane a moment before she got out. "Your father was right about you," Fitch said. She nodded and got out and stood in the yard. The windows were clear of boards. The porch was straight and solid. A thin line of smoke from the kitchen chimney rose into the cold March sky. Inside, she could hear Rue moving through the rooms, talking to herself in the comfortable, unhurried way she had started doing since they moved in. The condemnation order was still technically in place on paper. There was still a great deal of work to do. But the house was hers. Fully. Officially. Finally, she went inside. The artifact sale moved over the following 4 months through Perry Alcott's network of specialist dealers, auction houses, and private collectors. Hester did not rush. She declined the first offer made on everything. The currency collection went to 2 buyers, the bulk to a private collector in Nashville who had spent 11 years assembling a complete large-format American note set and responded to Perry's photographs within 3 hours. The gold certificates through a Louisville auction house that handled exactly this material. The gold coins went to a numismatic dealer in Chicago. The jewelry and the watch went through a Kentucky estate auction house. The letter went last, and that transaction was the most deliberate of all. Hester spoke to 4 institutions before accepting an offer from the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort. They wanted the letter as a permanent primary document. They also proposed a small exhibit around Corvin Shade's life and the property at 14 Cutter's Gap Road. Hester negotiated the sale to include a name display, the house, the man, the letter. The society agreed immediately. When Perry sent the final accounting, the total after all fees came to $341,000. Hester sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number on her phone. the largest number that had ever been near her name without a minus sign in front of it. She put the phone down and looked at the wall beside the fireplace. The safe was gone, removed during the cataloging process, but the rectangle where it had been was still faintly visible, even under the new plaster, if you knew where to look. Rue appeared in the doorway wearing paint on her hands and her jacket. She had been upstairs helping Orville's granddaughter patch the second-floor hallway. Orville says the upstairs is almost done, she said. Good. Rue looked at the wall. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Mom, when the man who hid everything in that safe sealed it up in 1943, do you think he knew someone like you would be the one to find it? Hester thought about Corvin Shade writing those words alone in this house. The right person will come eventually. I have faith in that. She thought about her father paying the $11, keeping silent for 20 years, signing his name to an affidavit to protect the daughter he had once failed. I think, she said, that two men made the same bet about the same thing, 80 years apart. Rue considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded, the slow, certain nod of a child who has understood something she will not forget. She went back upstairs. The condemnation order was formally lifted on a Wednesday in June. The county inspector signed the paperwork on the front porch while Orville Dietz stood beside him with his coffee. Carla Overbeck came that afternoon with a lemon cake and sat in the summer heat with her hands folded, looking at the house and the yard and the fields beyond it. Corvin would recognize it, she said quietly. This is what it looked like. Exactly this. That evening Hester stood on the back porch alone. Fields green and wide. The creek at the back of the property, just audible. The barn, rebuilt in new timber that Orville had matched as closely as he could to the original, square against the tree lean. Inside the house, Rue was laughing at something. The kitchen light spilled out across the porch boards and into the dark yard. Hester stood in the dark and breathed, and listened to her daughter's voice moving through the rooms of a house that had been empty for decades and was now full. She thought about the first night here, the cold floor, the plastic sheeting on the windows, Rue asleep under their one good blanket in the upstairs room, while Hester sat in the kitchen and added up the same numbers over and over and came up short every time. She thought about the coin in her palm, the breath that had broken in the middle, the whisper into the dark. Her father had not left her wealth. He had not left her rescue. He had thought about this. For 20 years he had owned that house and never touched it. If Clement had inherited it, he would have sold it within the week. If Forrest had inherited it, he would have hired someone to clear it out without setting foot inside. Neither of them would have driven 3 hours in January with $308 and a 7-year-old and pressed their hands against every wall until something pressed back. Birch Vane had known that. He had not left her the house because he thought she deserved it most. He had left her the house because she was the only one who would find what was inside it. The inheritance had not been a reward. It had been the only place where the right person could do what needed to be done. He had left her proof that he had seen who she was, that he had understood, in the end, too late to make up for everything, but not too late to matter, that the daughter who showed up was the one worth believing in. He had made one good bet at the end of his life. He had betted on her. She turned and went inside to her daughter. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Share it with someone today. You never know who in your life needs to hear it right now. And tell us where you are watching from. Drop your city, your country, your corner of this world in the comments. Whether you are in Kentucky, Texas, Georgia, New York, London, Toronto, Lagos, Nairobi, Kingston, Manila, Sydney, or anywhere else in this beautiful world, we want to know you are there. And one more thing, tell us what you think. Do you believe Birch Vane knew exactly what was inside that house? Or did he simply trust the one person who had always shown up and leave the rest to chance? Drop your answer below. We want to know. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. We have more stories coming. We will see you in the next one.